A Navy SEAL had grown exhausted by the noise and pressure of city life. It wasn't war that made him leave, but the feeling of being lost among things that once felt familiar. He left everything behind and bought a broken wooden cabin for just $50. The cabin's decay didn't discourage him, because in it he saw the chance for a different beginning. A small, poor village, buried in snow most of the year, yet still holding on to what the city had lost: human kindness. And in the heart of a brutal winter, a single choice would decide who would be seen and who would be forgotten. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. Like and subscribe to the channel. Every follow gives us the strength to share more meaningful stories. Now, let's begin. Elias Mercer stood just far enough from the bulletin board that he could pretend he wasn't reading it. The board was bolted to the brick wall outside the county office, its cork surface scarred by decades of thumbtacks and weather. Layers of paper overlapped in careless history-lost pets, church suppers, handyman ads written in slanted ink. The wind worried at the corners, lifting and dropping them like tired wings. Elias had no appointment inside, no reason to be there. He told himself that. At 35, he had learned the difference between not wanting and not admitting. This was the latter. Coda stood at his left, leash slack between them. The German Shepherd was 5 years old now, tall and lean, his coat a layered mix of cream, ash gray, and black that darkened along his spine. Snowmelt dampened the fur around his paws. His amber eyes tracked everything without seeming to focus on any one thing: cars passing, a woman exiting the building, a pigeon bold enough to hop close. Calm, alert, unrushed. Elias liked that about him. Elias himself looked like a man who belonged to no single place. 6 feet tall, about 1.83 meters built, lean and compact, the kind of strength that came from repetition rather than display. His face was clean-shaven, the razor lines sharp against a square jaw and high cheekbones. The skin of his face was light, but weathered, already touched by the cold of northern winds he hadn't yet reached. His hair, dark brown and cut in a restrained military style, had grown just long enough to soften regulation without erasing it. The discipline never really left. It just learned to sit quietly. He wore the same clothes he had worn for months: an olive gray tactical combat shirt, old enough that the fabric had gone soft, the cuffs and shoulders thinned and faded from use and wash. At the collar, why, a glimpse of the thermal layer beneath deep, muted red showed when he moved. His combat pants were brown-green, scuffed at the knees, the cargo pockets sagging slightly with habit. Work boots, military issue once, now creased and worn. On his wrist, a scratched field watch kept time without ceremony. He looked like someone passing through. He felt like someone waiting. The paper that held his attention was small compared to the others. No color. No bold type. County auction. Unclaimed property. Log cabin. Northern region. Minimum bid, $50. Elias read it again. $50 wasn't the point. He could afford more. He knew that, and the knowledge sat uncomfortably in his chest. If this were about money, the decision would already be made. What unsettled him was the question underneath the notice, the one that wasn't written down. What happens to people when there's nothing forcing them to behave? And cities answered that question with rules, cameras, schedules, noise, structure everywhere, order enforced until it felt natural. Elias had lived most of his adult life inside systems like that. Chains of command, mission parameters, consequences defined in advance. It worked. It saved lives. But it also hid something. He had begun to wonder, quietly, persistently, whether decency survived without pressure. Whether kindness existed when no one was watching, no rank to appeal to, no uniform to trust. The thought had followed him out of service and into civilian life like an unresolved operation. Coda stopped moving. The dog's posture changed subtly. No raised hackles, no tension in the leash. He simply stood still, head lifted, ears angled forward, gaze fixed not on the street or the building, but on the paper itself. Elias noticed immediately. "What is it?" he asked under his breath, not expecting an answer. Coda didn't look at him. That was the moment, the quiet, an ordinary moment that slid under his guard. A gust of wind tore one corner of the auction notice loose. It flapped sharply, the sound sudden and papery, and for the briefest second Elias felt the same sensation he used to get before stepping through a breach, an inexplicable tightening just below the ribs. Coda took one deliberate step forward, not pulling, not leading, choosing. Elias felt something click into place, not certainty, not excitement, but alignment. The rare feeling that his body and his thoughts had reached the same conclusion at the same time. He exhaled slowly. "All right," he murmured. The auction room was smaller than he expected. A dozen folding chairs, a long table at the front. The air smelled faintly of old paper and burnt coffee. A handful of people sat scattered through the room, most of them older, dressed for errands rather than opportunity. Elias took a seat near the back. Coda lay at his feet, head resting on his paws, eyes open. The auctioneer was a thin man in his late 50s, hair graying at the temples, wire-rim glasses sliding down a narrow nose. His suit jacket was too big, the sleeves bunching at the wrists. He had the tired efficiency of someone who had read too many lists aloud to care about any single item on them. He didn't look up when Elias entered. "Parcel A," the man said, voice flat. "Agricultural equipment. Minimum bid." The process unfolded without drama. Items sold or didn't. Numbers were called. Hands raised. Elias waited. When the auctioneer finally reached the line he had come for, his tone didn't change. "Log cabin," he read. "Northern region. Abandoned. Structural condition unknown. No utilities. Minimum bid, $50. Silence. A man in the front row shifted in his seat. Someone in the back coughed. No one moved. Elias felt his pulse in his throat. Not fast, just present. "50, the auctioneer repeated, almost apologetically. Elias raised his hand. The movement was small, controlled. Muscle memory. A few heads turned. Not judgmental. Curious. One man let out a soft, surprised chuckle, then looked away. "Going once," the auctioneer said. Coda lifted his head. "Going twice?" The gavel came down with a hollow knock that sounded louder than it should have. "Sold." Elias didn't smile. He didn't feel triumph. He felt weight. Outside, the sky had shifted. Clouds dragged low and gray, promising weather. Elias stood on the steps with the deed in his hand, the paper lighter than it had any right to be. Coda leaned into his leg, solid and warm. $50. A structure no one wanted. A place with no guarantees. Elias folded the paper carefully and slid it into his jacket. He looked north, not because he could see the cabin from here, but because direction mattered. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't asking what he was leaving behind, and he was asking what kind of man he would be when no one told him who to be. Elias left the county office, with the deed folded flat inside his jacket, the paper resting against his ribs like a quiet promise. He did not linger on the steps. He did not look back. The decision had been made without spectacle, and he intended to keep it that way. The drive north began before dawn. City lights fell away mile by mile, replaced by a colder clarity. The sky lightened from charcoal to steel, and then to a pale, rinsed blue that seemed to stretch farther than it ever had above concrete. Elias drove with both hands steady on the wheel. The heater turned low. He liked to feel the air as it was, not as he wished it to be. Coda lay curled on the passenger side floorboard, harness clipped, chin on his paws. The dog's breathing was slow and even. Every so often, and his ears twitched at sounds Elias barely registered, the whisper of tires on frost, the distant call of a bird waking before the sun. 5 years old, lean and strong, Coda carried himself with the quiet confidence of an animal that knew his place without needing to be told. Elias watched the road and thought about nothing on purpose. He had learned, over time, that forcing reflection often produced noise rather than insight. Better to let thoughts arrive on their own terms. The first snow appeared not as a storm, but as a suggestion-thin powder at the shoulders of the road, a pale dusting on the tops of fences. Trees changed too. Deciduous lines gave way to dark stands of pine, their needles heavy with last night's frost. The air sharpened. Elias cracked the window an inch and breathed in. Cold cut cleanly, like water. By late morning, the map on his dash led him off the highway and onto a narrower road that twisted through low hills. Houses thinned. Barns appeared. Weathered and practical, set back from the road as if giving it space. He passed a pickup pulled to the shoulder, a man in a thick jacket tightening a chain around a tire. The man looked up as Elias drove by, nodded once, and returned to his work. No waving, no questions. That felt right. The village came into view gradually, not announced by a sign so much as by the way the road softened into it. A handful of buildings clustered in a shallow valley, roofs pitched steep against snow. Smoke lifted from a few chimneys, thin gray threads dissolving into the sky. Elias slowed without thinking. Briar Hollow. The name fit. The place looked shaped by necessity rather than ambition. He parked near a small general store with a single window and a bell on the door. Coda stood as soon as the engine cut, tail level, posture neutral. Elias clipped the leash and stepped out into the cold. What the air smelled of wood smoke and damp earth. Snow crunched underfoot, not deep yet, but firm. Elias adjusted his jacket and took in the scene. A cafe with mismatched chairs visible through the window, a post office no larger than a shed, a community board mounted near a lamppost, its notices fewer and neater than the one back in the city. People noticed him. Not all at once, not openly, but eyes tracked him as he walked. He felt it the way he always had, a slight pressure at the edges of awareness. He did not bristle. He understood caution. He had built his life on it. Inside the general store, warmth hit him in a wave. The place was narrow, shelves packed with staples rather than variety. A woman stood behind the counter, mid-40s perhaps, average height, sturdy in the way of someone accustomed to lifting boxes and splitting wood. Her hair was pulled back into a practical ponytail, brown threaded with early gray. Her skin was pale and wind-touched, and her eyes a clear hazel that missed very little. She looked up as the bell rang. "Morning," she said, not unfriendly, not welcoming, observant. "Morning," Elias replied. His voice carried easily without rising. "Coffee?" "Pot's fresh." She nodded toward a thermal dispenser. $2. He poured himself a cup, black, and paid. Coda sat automatically by the door, eyes scanning, body relaxed, but ready. "You're not from around here," the woman said, setting his change on the counter. "No," Elias said. He did not offer more. She studied him for a second longer, then nodded. "Road's clear north of the ridge. For now." "Thank you." That earned him a faint smile, quick, restrained, the kind that came from usefulness rather than charm. Outside, Elias sipped the coffee and let the heat seep into his hands. The village was quiet, but not empty. A man crossed the street carrying a crate of firewood. 2 children passed on sleds, laughing, their breath puffing white. Life here did not rush. It accumulated. Elias felt a subtle easing in his chest, not relief recognition. He drove again, following directions that turned from pavement to gravel, then to packed dirt. Snow deepened along the edges. The trees closed in, taller now, their branches laced overhead like ribs. The road narrowed, but remained passable. Coda shifted, lifting his head. His ears angled forward, alert to something Elias could not yet hear. "Almost there," Elias said, though he wasn't sure how he knew. The cabin emerged from the trees without ceremony. It sat in a small clearing, low and dark against the white ground. The roof sagged slightly at the center. One window was boarded. The porch steps listed to one side, their edges softened by rot and weather. Vines, long dead, clung to the logs like old scars. Elias parked and cut the engine. Silence fell thick and immediate, broken only by the wind moving through pine needles, and he stepped out slowly. The cold here was different, deeper, more intent. It pressed in rather than passing through. Elias stood with his hands on his hips and took in the structure, not as a dream or a problem, but as a fact. "All right," he said quietly. Coda moved ahead a few steps, nose low, circling the perimeter. His tail remained level, not wagging, not stiff. Assessment mode. Elias walked the porch, testing each board with his weight. One creaked but held. The door resisted when he tried it, swollen with age. He leaned into it, shoulder first, and it gave with a groan that sounded like protest rather than failure. Inside, the air was cold and still. Dust motes floated in the thin light that filtered through the intact window. The floor was uneven planks warped, dirt showing in places. No furniture, no sign of recent habitation. Elias moved room to room, methodical. Walls first, then roof supports. He ran a hand along the logs, and feeling for softness. Some sections were rough but solid, others would need reinforcement. He cataloged everything without writing it down. Coda paused near the back wall, head tilted. He sniffed, then sat, eyes fixed on a narrow gap between logs. Elias crouched beside him. "What do you have?" he murmured. Coda did not growl. He did not bark. He simply watched the darkness beyond the gap, breathing slow. Elias waited with him, counting his own breaths, until the moment passed. When Coda finally looked back at him, Elias nodded once. Noted. As Elias stood to continue his inspection, a sound carried through the clearing, A single distant note, metallic and hollow. Not loud, not close. The kind of sound that could be explained a dozen ways and still leave a residue of unease. Koda's ears snapped toward it. His posture changed, subtle, contained but unmistakable. Elias froze, listening. The sound did not repeat. After a long moment, Koda relaxed, shaking out his coat as if dismissing the interruption. Elias exhaled slowly. He made no assumptions, but he did not forget the direction it had come from. By late afternoon, the light had shifted, thinning into a pale wash that promised early dusk. Elias unloaded what little he had brought, tools, blankets, a crate of dry food, and stacked it neatly along one wall. He built a small fire in the old stove after checking the flue twice, coaxing it to life with practiced care. Warmth spread gradually, uneven, but welcome. Elias sat on the floor with his back against the wall, boots still on, and drank from his canteen. He watched the fire and thought about the village, about the woman in the store, the man with the firewood, the children on sleds. No one had asked his name. He liked that too. Koda lay near the hearth, one eye open, the other closed, his body angled toward the door. Elias rested a hand on the dog's shoulder, feeling the steady heat beneath the fur. Outside, the wind picked up, a whispering through the trees. Snow began to fall again, soft and persistent. Elias closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to listen. For the first time in a long while, the quiet did not feel like an absence. It felt like space. Morning did not arrive all at once. It crept in through the single intact window as a pale, diluted light, thin enough that Elias barely noticed it at first. The fire in the stove had burned down to embers some time before dawn, leaving the air inside the cabin sharp and cold. His breath fogged faintly as he opened his eyes. For a moment, he stayed still. The floor beneath him was hard, the wall at his back rough with age. His muscles ached in the familiar way they did after a night spent alert rather than asleep. Not pain, just a reminder that his body had not forgotten how to endure. Koda lay a few feet away, curled near the stove, his tail tucked close to his flank. One amber eye opened as Elias shifted. The dog did not rise. He only watched, calm and assessing, the way he always did when waking somewhere new. "You good?" Elias murmured. Koda's tail thumped once against the floor. "Good enough." Elias pushed himself up and stood, joints popping softly. Cold pressed in from every direction now that the fire was gone. He rolled his shoulders, then moved methodically, checking the stove, the flue, the walls. The night had passed without collapse, without intrusion. That mattered more than comfort. Outside, snow had fallen steadily. Not deep yet, but enough to erase his tire tracks and soften the clearing into something quieter, more anonymous. Pines stood heavy with white, branches sagging under the weight. The cabin looked smaller in daylight. Not weaker, just honest. Elias stepped onto the porch, boots crunching, and scanned the tree line. No movement, no sound beyond wind and the occasional creak of wood adjusting to temperature. He inhaled slowly, the cold biting cleanly into his lungs. This place did not care who he was. That, more than anything, felt like an invitation. And he spent the morning working, not fixing yet assessing. Elias believed in understanding a structure before touching it. He moved around the cabin in a slow circuit, notebook out, pencil scratching as he marked problem areas. Load-bearing points. Rot. The way snow would drift against the north wall once winter deepened. Inside, he tested floorboards, tapping and listening for hollow answers. Some planks bowed but held. Others would need replacement. The roof sagged at the center, but the beams beneath were still solid, old-growth logs that had been cut when trees were thicker and winters were meaner. Whoever built this place had known what they were doing. They had just been alone too long. Coda followed him from room to room, nails clicking softly. The dog paused often, nose low, scenting. His movements were deliberate, not anxious. 5 years old, in his prime, his coat thickened already for the cold season. Cream and gray along his sides, a darker along the back, as if shadow had settled there permanently. "You're cataloging too," Elias said quietly. Coda's ears flicked back at the sound of his voice, then forward again. Agreement, or at least acknowledgement. By midday, Elias's hands were numb despite the gloves. He paused long enough to eat a protein bar and drink water, then went back to work. Sweat cooled quickly in the cold air, but he didn't mind. Discomfort was information. The cabin answered him slowly. Some things would hold, others would not. But there was no single fatal flaw. No obvious reason the place couldn't be made into what he imagined, a small, tight structure, capable of sheltering more than just one man and a dog if it had to. That thought lingered longer than he expected. He straightened and looked out toward the trees again, then dismissed the impulse. Planning for contingencies came easily to him. It did not mean he expected to need them. In the early afternoon, Elias loaded up and drove back toward the village. The road was rougher now, snow-packed in places, but passable. He parked near the general store again, the same bell announcing his entry. The woman behind the counter looked up, recognition flickering briefly across her face. "You found it," she said, not a question. "Yes." She nodded once. "Most people don't come back. I needed supplies." "That makes sense." She gestured toward the shelves. "What are you fixing first?" "Heat," Elias said without hesitation. That earned him another quick look sharper this time. Approval, maybe. He gathered what he could afford and what the store had. Extra firewood, nails, a roll of insulation that had been sitting too long to sell quickly. The woman rang him up without commentary. "Name's Ruth," she said as she handed him the receipt, "in case you need to ask for something." "Elias," he replied. She nodded, committing it to memory without ceremony. Weather's turning by tonight. Wind's supposed to pick up. I'll be ready." Ruth studied him for a second longer, then inclined her head. "Good." Outside, Coda waited patiently, sitting rather than lying down, his gaze fixed on the road leading back into the trees. Elias loaded the truck, then paused, hand on the door. "You need anything?" he asked Ruth, half expecting the question to sound strange. She shook her head. "We manage." The answer was simple, and it carried weight. He was halfway back to the cabin when the sky darkened abruptly. Clouds rolled in low and fast, their undersides bruised purple and gray. Wind cut across the road, lifting loose snow into brief, blinding sheets. Elias slowed, hands steady, eyes tracking the edges. Coda shifted in his seat, posture rising, ears forward. "I see it," Elias said. The clearing appeared through the trees just as the first hard gust hit. Elias parked quickly and moved with purpose, unloading supplies as the wind began to howl in earnest. Snow stung exposed skin. The temperature dropped fast, the kind of sudden cold that settled into bones. Inside, the cabin creaked as if waking. Elias lit the stove again, feeding it carefully, watching the flame catch and grow. Warmth spread unevenly, but it was enough to push the worst of the cold back. He reinforced the door with a temporary brace, then moved to the window, checking the boards. Coda stood near the center of the room, body angled toward the back wall again. His head tilted slightly, nostrils flaring. Elias noticed. Coda let out a low, uncertain sound, not a growl, not a bark. A question rather than a warning. Elias knelt beside him, hand resting lightly between the dog's shoulders. He followed Coda's gaze to the narrow seam between logs where cold air slipped through in a thin, constant line. Nothing moved. Still, Elias felt a prickle of awareness climb his spine, not fear, but attention. He pressed his palm to the wall and felt the vibration of wind on the other side, the living pressure of weather and forest. "Just the storm," he said softly, more to himself than to Coda. The dog did not look away immediately. When he finally did, he settled at Elias's side, tension easing but not gone. Elias filed the moment away. The storm did not break the cabin. It tested it. Wind battered the walls through the evening, snow piling high against the north side. The stove burned steadily, the reinforced door held, and the roof beams groaned but did not shift. Elias worked through the worst of it, sealing drafts where he could, moving deliberately, conserving energy. By nightfall, the storm eased into a steady whisper. Elias sat on the floor again, back against the wall, exhaustion settling in layers rather than all at once. He ate in silence, listening to the sounds of the cabin cooling and contracting. Coda lay beside him, head on his paws, eyes half-lidded but alert. As the dog's presence was grounding in a way Elias did not try to explain. It simply was. "This place isn't gentle," Elias said quietly. Coda's tail thumped once. "But it's honest." Outside, the wind moved on, leaving behind a clean, hard cold. Snow reflected moonlight, turning the clearing pale and still. Elias closed his eyes, not to escape the quiet, but to accept it. The cabin had tested him. He had not failed. Elias did not go into the village the morning after the storm. He stayed at the cabin, letting the quiet settle back into place. Snow lay clean and uninterrupted across the clearing, the world reset into something simpler. The storm had tested the structure and moved on, leaving behind evidence rather than damage drifts piled along the north wall, a branch cracked and half-buried near the tree line, the faint scent of cold iron in the air. The cabin had held. That mattered. Elias moved through his morning routine without hurry. He rekindled the stove, boiled water, ate sparingly. His body felt heavy but intact, the fatigue of sustained attention rather than exhaustion. This was the kind of tiredness he trusted. Coda stepped outside first, harness already on, breath steaming as he took in the clearing. He was alert but calm, posture loose, his tail low. The dog circled once, twice, then stopped and looked back at Elias, waiting. "All right," Elias said. "Let's see what held and what didn't." They walked the perimeter together. Elias checked the bracing he had added, pressed his weight against the door, tested the window boards. Snow slid off the roof in small avalanches as the sun rose higher, light catching on the ice crystals and scattering it into brief, blinding flashes. He made notes. Quiet ones. Mental adjustments. It was while he was inspecting the southern wall that he sensed movement beyond the trees, not sudden, not threatening, just present. Elias straightened slowly. A man stood at the edge of the clearing. He was older than Elias by at least 20 years, tall but slightly stooped, the posture of someone whose body remembered heavier days. His coat was thick and dark, worn smooth at the elbows. A gray knit cap was pulled low over hair that had gone fully silver, and his beard, short, neatly kept, was the same color, framing a face carved by weather and restraint. The man did not approach. He simply stood there, hands resting loosely at his sides, studying the cabin with an intensity that felt professional rather than curious. Coda noticed him a heartbeat later. The dog did not bark. He stepped forward half a pace, body angled protectively but without tension, ears forward. Elias waited. Finally, the man spoke. "You shored the north wall before the storm," he said. His voice was low, steady, carrying easily through the cold air. "That's why it held." Elias nodded once. It needed it. The man's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Most people would have patched the door and hoped." "Hope's not load-bearing," Elias said. That earned him a longer look. The man stepped closer now, boots crunching softly in the snow. Up close, Elias could see the lines around his eyes, the old scar cutting through one eyebrow. But this was a face that had learned to give little away, not because it was hiding, but because it had learned that not everything needed to be shown. "I'm Silas Granger," the man said. "I live east of here, down the ridge." "Elias." Silas's gaze flicked briefly to Coda. "Good dog." "He's fair," Elias said. "Not generous." Silas huffed quietly at that. "That's better." They stood in silence for a moment, the kind that did not press to be filled. Silas's eyes moved over the cabin again, taking in the sag of the roof, the pitch of the beams, the way snow had drifted against certain sections. "You planning to rebuild?" Silas said. "Or just survive the winter?" "Depends," Elias replied, "on what the place will tolerate." Silas nodded slowly. "It'll tolerate more than you think, less than you hope." That sounded like experience. Silas shifted his weight, then reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He held it out. Elias took it without stepping closer. It was a rough sketch, charcoal lines smudged by use, a floor plan not of the cabin as it was, but as it could be, reinforced supports, a tighter inner core, a heat sink built into the central wall. Elias studied it, pulse ticking a little faster. "This is yours?" he asked. Silas shrugged. "Once, years ago." "You didn't build it?" "No." The word carried more than refusal. It carried finality. Elias folded the paper carefully. "Why show me now?" Silas met his eyes. "Because you didn't do the easy thing. And because I don't want to watch another man make the same choice I did." That landed heavier than Elias expected. They moved inside without ceremony. The cabin was cold, but brighter now, daylight filtering through the window. Silas walked the space with measured steps, hand trailing lightly along the logs, as if greeting old acquaintances. He stopped beneath the sagging beam at the center of the roof and looked up. "You can save this," he said, "but you'll need to change how the weight moves. Storms will keep finding that weakness." "I know," Elias said. "I was thinking—" Silas raised a hand. "Show me." Elias did. They spoke in gestures and brief sentences, the language of people used to working where mistakes cost more than time. Silas listened, then adjusted, suggesting alternatives that made Elias rethink his assumptions. Coda lay near the door, head up, eyes tracking them both. When Silas moved too quickly, the dog's ears flicked, but there was no warning, no tension, just attention. Silas noticed. "He trusts you," Silas said, glancing at Coda. "He trusts consistency," Elias replied. Silas nodded. "Smart." They worked through the afternoon, marking spots on the walls, measuring, recalculating. Silas's hands were steady, though slower than they might once have been. His movements were economical, practiced. The body of a man who had built things for a long time, and broken some, too. At one point, Elias caught Silas watching him. Not the work, but him. The look wasn't judgmental. It was reflective. As if Silas were seeing a version of himself he hadn't allowed to exist. "You didn't come out here to hide," Silas said eventually. "No," Elias agreed. Silas exhaled slowly. "Neither did I. Once." The admission hung between them, fragile but real. As the light shifted toward evening, Coda rose suddenly and moved to Silas's side. He sniffed the man's hand, then leaned in, resting his weight briefly against Silas's leg. A deliberate, grounding gesture. Silas froze. For a second, the careful distance he carried cracked. His hand hovered, uncertain, before settling on Coda's neck. He swallowed hard, eyes fixed on nothing. "Haven't had a dog do that in a long time," he said quietly. Elias said nothing. The moment passed, but something had shifted. They stepped outside together as dusk settled. The clearing was quiet again, the air clean and sharp. Silas pulled his coat tighter. "I'll come back tomorrow," he said. "If you want, there's a better way to anchor that beam." "I'd appreciate it." Silas nodded. "Good. Don't wait too long to start. Winter doesn't." With that, he turned and headed back into the trees, his figure swallowed gradually by shadow and snow. Elias stood where he was, the folded sketch warm in his pocket. Coda sat at his side, watching the path Silas had taken until it disappeared completely. Elias looked back at the cabin, at the lines of stress and potential, at the work ahead. For the first time since arriving, he did not feel alone with it. Not because help had arrived, but because someone else had recognized the choice he was making and understood its cost. The decision to stand watch was not announced. Elias did not call a meeting. He did not ask permission. He simply began doing it. The first night, he walked the edge of the clearing after dusk, Coda moving beside him like a shadow that had learned how to breathe. The snow had hardened into a thin crust, crunching softly under their boots and paws. The air carried the clean, sharp smell of cold iron and pine sap. From the village below, faint points of light flickered windows, porch lamps, the soft glow of a generator somewhere near the general store. Briar Hollow settled early. Darkness came fast this far north, and people learned to finish what they needed before it arrived. Elias walked because walking let him think without spiraling. He told himself this wasn't about proving anything. He wasn't trying to earn trust or make a point. The truth was simpler and harder to explain. The village felt fragile, like a structure that would hold only if enough people noticed when it started to strain. He knew that feeling. Coda paused at the edge of the tree line, nose lifting. Elias stopped with him, scanning the darkness. Nothing moved. No sound beyond wind in branches. "All right," Elias murmured. "We keep going." They did. Down the narrow path that led toward the communal storage shed. Past the old tractor left half buried in snow. Past the fence line where boards leaned but still stood. Elias made mental notes the way he always had, where sound carried, where light pooled, where shadows hid more than they should. Not because he expected trouble, but because attention was a habit that saved lives. By the third night, people noticed. Not openly. No one thanked him. But the general store stayed unlocked a little later. Then a porch light flicked on where it hadn't before. Small adjustments. Signs of relief, or at least of awareness. Coda noticed too. The dog's posture softened slightly as the nights passed, though his alertness never dropped. His harness caught faint glints of moonlight, the dark red trim barely visible against his black straps. He moved with quiet purpose, ears pivoting, nose testing the air. On the fourth night, the cold sharpened. The temperature dropped fast after sunset, the kind of cold that bit through layers and settled into joints. Elias pulled his collar higher and flexed his fingers inside his gloves. Coda's breath steamed steadily. They were near the storage shed when Coda stopped short. Not froze. Stopped. His body angled left, weight shifting forward, ears rigid. His tail lifted slightly, not stiff, but alert. Elias followed the line of the dog's gaze. A shadow moved. Small. Quick. Gone before Elias could focus. He waited, counting off slow seconds in his head. The shadow did not return. Coda looked back at him, then toward the direction the movement had gone, then back again. Questioning. Elias nodded once. Yeah, I saw it. They moved. Not running. Running chased people into panic. Elias knew that too. They followed the tracks easily enough. Small boots, worn soles, the tread uneven. The prints veered away from the village proper and toward the abandoned lots near the old mill. Coda kept his nose low now, pace controlled. The dog did not pull. He tracked. The building loomed ahead, a dark shape against darker trees. The mill had been shut down years ago, its windows broken, roof partially collapsed. Snow drifted through the open spaces, piling in corners where no one went anymore. Elias slowed. He could hear breathing. Not labored. Not panicked. Controlled, but young. "Hey," Elias called softly, keeping his voice level. "I see you." Silence answered him. Coda took one careful step forward and sat. A deliberate choice, not a threat. "Not here to hurt you," Elias continued, "but you shouldn't be out in this cold." A figure shifted near the far wall, then another, smaller. The first stepped into the light. He couldn't have been more than 18. Thin, but not fragile. The kind of thin that came from too many meals skipped rather than sickness. His jacket was oversized, patched at the elbows, sleeves hanging long over his hands. Dark hair fell into his eyes, untrimmed and uneven, as if cut by someone without a mirror. His face was sharp-boned, cheekbones prominent, jaw clenched tight. Fear sat in his posture like a coiled spring. "I'm sorry," the boy said quickly. We weren't breaking anything." Elias raised a hand, palm out. "I know." The boy hesitated, clearly not convinced. Behind him, a smaller figure peeked out. A girl, maybe 7 or 8, wrapped in too many layers, none of them matching. Her hat was pulled down too far, covering one eye. Strands of light brown hair escaped around her ears. Her cheeks were red with cold, her lips pale. She held a piece of bread in both hands, like it might disappear if she loosened her grip. Koda's attention shifted immediately. He stood and moved toward her, slow and careful, stopping well short. He lowered his head slightly and exhaled, a warm breath clouding the air between them. The girl stared at him, wide-eyed. "He won't hurt you," Elias said, watching her rather than the boy. "He's just checking." The boy stepped half a pace forward, instinctively protective. "She's fine," he said, though his voice wavered. Koda sat again. The girl's shoulders eased a fraction. "What's your name?" Elias asked. The boy hesitated, then answered. "Rowan." "And hers?" The boy glanced back at the girl. "Maisie." Maisie lifted her chin, trying to be brave. Her hands shook anyway. Elias felt something tighten behind his ribs. Not pain. Not quite. Recognition. "How long have you been here?" Elias asked. Rowan swallowed. "Oh, a while." That could mean anything from days to weeks. "Where were you headed tonight?" Elias asked. Rowan's jaw set. "Back." "To where?" Rowan didn't answer. Koda shifted closer to Maisie, not touching her, just existing in her space, radiating warmth. The girl leaned forward slightly without realizing it, drawn by instinct. Elias noticed. "You hungry?" he asked quietly. Rowan's eyes flashed defensive, ashamed. "We ate." The bread in Maisie's hands was almost gone. Elias nodded as if that settled it. "There's a storm coming later. Colder than this." Rowan's shoulders tightened. "We can handle it." Elias believed he believed that. "I've got a fire," Elias said, "and more food than I need." Rowan looked at him hard now, searching for something: threat, trick, pity. Elias let him look. "I'm not the law," Elias added, "and I'm not asking you to stay." Koda looked back at Elias, then at Rowan. The dog's tail gave a single, slow wag. Careful. Maisie took a small step forward before Rowan could stop her. The boy exhaled sharply, then closed his eyes for a second, as if making a decision he didn't want to have to make. "Just until she warms up," Rowan said. "Then we're gone." "That's fine," Elias replied. They walked back toward the cabin together. Rowan kept himself between Elias and Maisie the entire way, posture tense, ready to bolt. Elias did not comment. He remembered what it felt like to be 18, and convinced the world only took. The cabin light spilled out into the snow as Elias opened the door. Warmth followed. Maisie stopped just inside, staring at the fire as if it were unreal. Koda stepped past her and lay down near the hearth, claiming the spot with quiet certainty. Elias handed Rowan a blanket. "You can sit there." Rowan hesitated, then guided Maisie down. She wrapped the blanket around herself immediately, shivering, easing in small increments. Elias set water on the stove, moved with practiced efficiency. He did not hover, and he did not rush them. "This is just for the night," Rowan said again, voice softer now. Elias nodded. "Of course." Maisie reached out and touched Koda's fur with 2 fingers. The dog didn't move. "Warm," she whispered. Koda's tail thumped once. Elias sat back against the wall, watching them both, the fire crackling between. He did not think of himself as a savior. He had learned the danger of that story. He thought of himself as someone who knew what it meant to be young, cold, and unclaimed, and what it meant when someone chose not to look away. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the walls. Inside, the fire held. Morning came with tension already woven into it. Elias woke before the light fully reached the cabin, The fire reduced to a dull glow of embers. The air was warmer than the night before, carrying the faint, comforting smell of wood smoke and boiled oats. He lay still for a moment, listening, not for danger, but for people. Maisie slept curled tight beneath the blanket, her breathing shallow but steady. One small hand clutched the fabric as if afraid it might vanish. Rowan sat upright against the far wall, back straight despite the exhaustion pulling at his shoulders. He had not slept. Elias could tell by the way the boy's eyes tracked every movement, sharp and hollow at the same time. Coda lay between them, a quiet barrier made of fur and warmth. One ear flicked when Elias shifted. He did not rise. "Morning," Elias said softly. Rowan nodded once. "We'll be out of your way soon." "After you eat," Elias replied. Rowan hesitated, pride flaring briefly, then faded. He looked at Maisie instead, and gave a short nod. They ate in silence, the kind that wasn't awkward, just heavy. Elias kept his movements slow and predictable. He remembered what it felt like to be young, and convinced that every kindness came with a hook. When they finished, Elias stood and pulled on his jacket. "I'm going into the village," he said. "You can stay here. Door stays locked." Rowan stiffened. "We don't want trouble." "I know," Elias said. "This isn't that." Coda rose as well, stretching, then moved to the door. He glanced back at Maisie, then at Rowan, as if memorizing them. Outside, the cold had sharpened again. The sky was a pale, brittle blue, clouds gathering low at the horizon. Elias walked toward the village with Coda at his side, snow crunching underfoot. He felt it before he saw it, the shift in the air. People were already talking. Not in a crowd, not openly. In pairs, in doorways. Conversations stopped as Elias passed. Eyes followed him more directly now, less curious, more measuring. Ruth stood outside the general store, arms crossed against the cold. Her expression was tight, her jaw set. "You brought them back with you," she said as Elias approached. "Yes." "People are saying you're harboring thieves." Elias nodded once. "People say things." Ruth studied him, then glanced at Coda. "You don't look like a man who doesn't understand consequences." "I do," Elias said. "I just don't avoid them." She sighed. "Council's meeting at the hall. Now." "Then I'll be there." The hall was small, wooden, built long before anyone worried about insulation. A dozen people stood inside by the time Elias arrived. Men and women of varying ages, bundled in coats, faces drawn tight by cold and concern. Silas stood near the back, arms folded, expression unreadable. He met Elias's eyes briefly and gave a single, subtle nod. A man Elias hadn't met before stepped forward. Mid-40s. Broad shoulders softened by age, beard thick and uneven, shot through with gray. His nose had been broken at least once. His eyes were sharp, restless. "That's him," the man said. "That's the one living up by the old mill road." Elias didn't interrupt. "We've had supplies go missing," the man continued. "Food, fuel, since he arrived." A murmur rippled through the room. Elias waited until it settled. "How much?" he asked. The man blinked. "What? How much is missing?" The question wasn't defiant. It was practical. "Well enough," the man said. "That's not a number," Elias replied calmly. The man flushed. "You think this is a game?" "No," Elias said. "I think fear makes people careless with facts." The room went quiet. Ruth stepped forward. "Elias, people are scared. Winter's tightening. We don't have much margin." "I know," Elias said. That's why I didn't turn 2 children back out into the cold. That landed harder than shouting would have. Children? Someone echoed. Silas moved then, stepping into the open. They're not thieves, he said. His voice carried weight, not because it was loud, but because people recognized it. They're hungry. The bearded man scoffed. You don't know that. I know what hunger looks like, Silas replied. I've worn it. A woman near the door spoke up, her voice tight. She was thin, pale, hair pulled back too tightly. And if we help everyone who wanders in, what happens when we have nothing left? Elias felt the question settle into his chest. It was a fair one. He stepped forward. No one's asking you to save the world, he said, just to decide who you are when it's inconvenient. The words hung there, raw and unpolished. Coda, who had been sitting quietly at Elias's side, suddenly rose and turned his head toward the open doorway. His ears snapped forward, body tense. When a sharp crack sounded outside, wood splitting under stress. Everyone froze. Coda let out a single, sharp bark. Elias was already moving. They found it at the fuel shed. The door hung open, hinges bent. Inside, several containers lay tipped, fuel seeping into the snow, the sharp smell cutting through the cold. Footprints adult-sized led, away toward the tree line. Not the light, uneven tracks Elias had seen the night before. These were heavier, deliberate. Damn it, Ruth whispered. Elias crouched, examining the tracks. This wasn't Rowan. Silas knelt beside him. No, he agreed. This is someone who knows what they're doing. The bearded man's face drained of color. Then who? Elias stood. Someone who knows you're afraid, and is using it. The silence that followed was different, not defensive, reflective. They returned to the hall without speaking much. People looked at Elias differently now, not with trust, not yet, but with recalibration. Ruth exhaled slowly. We owe you an apology. Elias shook his head. No one owes me anything. What about the kids? The thin woman asked, quieter now. They stay with me, Elias said. For now. And after? She pressed. Elias met her gaze. After we talk, like adults. Silas stepped forward again. I'll help. With food, with repairs, whatever's needed. Others nodded, reluctantly at first, then more firmly. Not unity, but movement. Elias walked back to the cabin alone, Coda pacing beside him. The sky had darkened again, clouds pressing low. Snow would come soon. Heavy by the feel of it. At the cabin, Rowan stood on the porch, rigid with fear. They're mad, the boy said. They're scared, Elias replied. Different thing. And us? Elias looked past him, to Maisie sitting by the fire, hands wrapped around a cup, cheeks finally flushed with warmth. You're not invisible, Elias said. That matters. Rowan swallowed. I don't want to be a problem. Elias considered him carefully, and the sharp edges, the stubbornness, the responsibility he carried too young. You're not, Elias said, but you are part of what this place is becoming, whether you like it or not. That night, the wind rose again. Snow began to fall in thick, steady sheets. Elias stood at the window, watching the dark close in. Coda pressed against his leg. The village had not chosen kindness yet, but it had chosen to look. And sometimes, that was the harder step. The storm arrived without drama. There was no single moment when it announced itself. No thunder, no sudden violence. It came the way winter things often did in the north. Steadily, relentlessly, as if it had always been on its way and had simply reached the point where waiting no longer made sense. By mid-afternoon, snow was falling thick enough to erase distance. The trees beyond the clearing faded into pale shapes, then into nothing at all. Wind pressed against the cabin walls in long, patient pushes, testing seams and corners the way water tested stone. Elias had prepared as much as he could. Extra firewood stacked inside. Doors braced. The inner space cleared so people could move if they needed to. He had done it all without ceremony, without saying this might be bad, because panic was contagious and precision was not. Rowan worked beside him, silent and focused. In daylight, the boy looked younger than he had the night before. The sharpness remained, jaw tight, eyes alert, but there was a rawness beneath it now, an exhaustion that came from being responsible for too much, too soon. His hair had been combed back with water, revealing a narrow scar at his temple, pale against skin gone rough from cold. Maisie stayed near the fire, wrapped in layers, Coda at her side like an anchor. She watched everything with wide attention, absorbing tone and movement more than words. Every so often she reached out to touch Coda's harness, tracing the dark red trim with her finger, as if reassuring herself it was real. "You don't have to help," Elias told Rowan as they secured the last brace. Rowan shook his head. "I want to." Elias accepted that. Wanting mattered. Outside, the wind rose another notch. Snow struck the cabin in waves now, hissing against the logs. Whilst the temperature dropped fast, the cold deepening until it felt less like weather and more like pressure. By evening, the village lights were gone. Power didn't fail all at once. It flickered, returned, then flickered again. Elias noticed the pattern and said nothing. He trusted the people below to do what they could. He stood by the window and watched the white swallow the world. Coda's posture changed before Elias heard anything. The dog lifted his head, ears snapping forward, body tensing in a way that was not fear, but readiness. His amber eyes fixed on the tree line, not at the clearing's edge, but beyond it, toward the village. Elias followed his gaze. A faint glow pulsed through the snow, then another, not steady, not right. "Stay here," Elias said to Rowan, already pulling on his outer layer. Rowan looked at the window, then back at Elias. "What is it?" "Trouble," Elias replied. "The kind that doesn't wait." Coda was at the door before Elias finished speaking. And the walk toward the village was brutal. Wind cut sideways, driving snow into Elias's face, into his collar, into the gaps he had sealed as carefully as he could. Visibility dropped to a few yards at best. Coda moved ahead, harness low against his body, muscles working beneath his thickening winter coat. The glow resolved into fire. The fuel shed stood out against the storm, orange light flaring through its broken door. Flames licked along the edge of the roof, fed by spilled fuel that hissed and flared as snow tried and failed to smother it. People shouted. Shapes moved through the white. Elias took it in with a single sweep of attention. Too much fuel lost already. Wind pushing flame toward the storage wall. If it spread. "Buckets!" someone yelled. "Form a line!" They tried. Snow clogged hands and slowed feet. Water froze before it could be thrown. Silas stood near the shed, coat dusted white, face set in grim focus. He held an axe, using it to knock loose burning boards before they could catch further. Elias moved to him without thinking. "Fuel line's compromised," Elias said into the wind. "We need to starve it." Silas nodded sharply. "Roof first." They worked side by side. No need for explanation. Elias climbed, boots finding purchase where they shouldn't have. Heat blasted up as he reached the roofline, flames roaring close enough to singe fabric. Below, someone slipped and fell. Another screamed when sparks caught a sleeve. Coda barked sharp, commanding then broke from Elias's peripheral vision, sprinting toward the far edge of the shed. Elias saw it then. A figure pinned beneath a fallen beam. A man, older, heavy-set, face red and slick with sweat despite the cold. His leg twisted at an angle that made Elias's stomach tighten. Coda skidded to a stop beside him, barking again, louder this time. Not panicked. Urgent. Elias dropped from the roof without thinking, landing hard, pain flaring through his knees and then fading under adrenaline. He reached the man and assessed quickly. "Don't move," Elias said, gripping the beam. "You hear me?" The man nodded frantically, breath coming in ragged bursts. His beard was ice-crusted, eyes wide and glassy with fear. Elias braced, muscles screaming as he lifted. The beam shifted, then gave. Silas was there instantly, hauling with him, together freeing the trapped leg. The man screamed as pressure released, then sobbed, clutching at Elias's jacket. "Easy," Elias said, steady. "You're out." They dragged him clear as the roof collapsed inward, flames surging briefly before dying down as fuel finally ran out. The fire burned itself into exhaustion. What remained was wreckage, smoke, and silence broken only by wind. As Elias turned back toward the village, Coda froze. Not barked. Not moved. Frozen. His head tilted, ears forward, eyes locked on something in the storm beyond the shed. For one suspended second, Elias felt the old instinct rise, the sense that the worst moment hadn't arrived yet. And then Coda looked back at him. Not urgent, certain. Elias followed the dog's gaze and saw, through the thinning snow, lights coming back on in the village, one by one. The storm was not done, but it had loosened its grip. They moved the injured man to the hall, using sleds and brute determination. Inside, people worked without argument now. Hands passing supplies, voices low and focused. Maisie sat wrapped in blankets near the wall, eyes wide but dry. Rowan stood beside her, one hand on her shoulder, the other clenched tight at his side. When he saw Elias, Rowan's breath hitched. "You okay?" the boy asked. Elias nodded. "You?" Rowan glanced down at Maisie. "She's warm." "That's good." Silas approached, his face pale beneath his beard, a dark stain spreading across his sleeve where he'd been burned. "You should sit," Elias said. Silas shook his head. "Not yet." The words were stubborn, but there was relief in them too. The storm eased near dawn. Snow still fell, but gently now, like something finishing a thought, rather than insisting on it. The wind dropped to a whisper. Outside, the world looked wrecked and untouched at the same time. The village stood, not whole, not unchanged, but standing. Later, when the injured were tended and the fires banked, Elias walked back to the cabin alone, Coda pacing beside him. The path was barely visible now, reshaped by drifts, but Elias trusted his sense of direction. Inside, the cabin felt smaller somehow, warmer, lived in. Rowan and Maisie arrived not long after, guided by Silas. They stood awkwardly near the door, unsure where they fit now. "This place," Rowan began, then stopped. Elias waited. "It saved people," Rowan finished quietly. Elias looked around at the scuffed floor, the reinforced walls, the fire that had not gone out. "It did what it was built to do." Silas met Elias's eyes. "You didn't build a house," he said. "You built a decision." Elias did not argue. Outside, the first weak light of morning touched the snow, turning it pink, then gold. Coda lay down near the hearth, finally allowing himself to rest. Maisie curled up beside him without asking. Rowan watched them, then looked at Elias. What happens now? Elias considered the question. The storm had taken fuel. It had taken safety. It had taken certainty. What it had left was harder to name. "We keep going," Elias said at last. "Together, if we choose to." Rowan nodded slowly. Silas smiled. Not wide, not easy, but real. Elias sat by the fire and let the quiet settle. The storm had come. It had taken what it could. And what remained, what chose to remain, was enough. Sometimes miracles don't arrive as thunder or light from the sky. They arrive quietly, in a warm fire on a night that should have been deadly, in a stranger who chooses to stay when walking away would be easier, in a village that decides just once to look instead of turn away. The Bible says that faith the size of a mustard seed can move mountains. But most days, faith doesn't move mountains. It moves people. It moves a hand to reach out. It moves a heart to stay open. It moves a choice from fear to compassion. Maybe that's how God works most of the time, not through grand miracles we can't miss, but through small, human decisions we almost don't notice. If you're watching this, and life feels cold right now, if you feel unseen, exhausted, or unsure where you belong, remember this. You don't need to be perfect to be protected. But you don't need to be strong to be worthy of warmth. Sometimes all it takes is one place, one moment, one person who refuses to let the fire go out. If this story touched something in you, share it with someone who might need a reminder tonight. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from, or what part of the story stayed with you. And if you'd like to keep walking through stories like this together, consider subscribing to the channel. May God watch over you and your family. May He bring warmth where there is cold, hope where there is weariness, and light where the road feels long. Until next time, take care of yourself.